Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 167. A lamp ablaze, a lamp extinguished. Everyone agreed that the main objective of challenging their opponents to a battle this time would be to get rid of Liang Danhuo. As for An Lushan, he had surpassed what anyone could do about him, but even until now, at least based on what the exorcism department had learned, the Heart Devil had not yet had a real chance to fight on the battlefield. In the past, it had always been the Huashi, the bear Yao, wine, lust, greed, and pride, Liang Danhuo, and other Yao at that level who had sought out and gathered food for him, as well as living humans or dead corpses for sacrifices. An Lushan had never once brazenly shown himself on the battlefield, coming in with great fanfare to grab humans and eat them in large gulps. Li Jinglong had also considered this question once upon a time: why did An Lushan not appear on the battlefield? There must be a reason, but they did not know what was happening on the inside. Once, when Li Jinglong had been reading through the ancient records in the Luoyang exorcism department, he had found a potentially reasonable explanation: divine retribution. The changes that the vengeful souls in the world underwent, one dying, another one living, one being born into the world, one dying, transforming, turning into a Yao, becoming a devil, that was all closely linked with the divine and earthly veins. Legend had it that if a Yaogwai were to wantonly massacre people, it would summon the divine wrath of the heavens down on it, which was a tribulation by lightning. If it was unable to survive the lightning tribulation, then it would be scattered into ashes, which would disperse on the wind. Snakes who wished to turn into dragons, likewise, were also breaking some restriction, and they would also bring down a divine retribution on themselves. Back in the day, this was the exact reason why Xiaoyu had laid out his plans in Chang'an so meticulously, and why he had made sure to entrench himself at every step. But no one had ever witnessed a heavenly tribulation, and no one knew how to survive the strikes of lightning. It was with that information that Li Jinglong hypothesized: whether it was Xiaoyu or An Lushan, they were constantly probing around to avoid any sort of unneeded trouble, doing their best not to cross some line. And that line was drawn at directly killing large amounts of mortals. As for how much was a large amount, no matter if it was the exorcism department, their enemies, or even Direnja, no one could come up with an accurate number. And so the An and the Shi families had allied to incite rebellion, using mortals to kill mortals, before then absorbing their resentment. That was a safe option. In other words, if they could let mortals do the killing, then they would definitely never let the Yaogwai do it. What the Yaogwai could kill, An Lushan would never have to personally kill. Our goal is to achieve a stalemate with An Lushan, Li Jinglong said, after spending a long time analyzing the situation. We'll get rid of Liang Danhuo, and the army will retreat back to Tongpass. If we can make the rebels retreat towards Luoyang, that'll be even better. What are Liang Danhuo's weaknesses? Ashinakayan looked towards Atai. Amongst all of them, only Atai had actually crossed swords with her. Plus, this one was the most difficult of the bunch to deal with. Never mind that she was a painted skin, she also knew how to release a blood mist to kill people, and besides killing people, she even knew how to fly. Even Wuqiu back then had not been such a thorn in their sides. How was the spell of the blood pool dealt with back then? Atai suddenly thought back to the past, to the battle where they had fought to subdue Wuqiu. Qiang and Lu Su had not participated in that. Li Jinglong suddenly found an odd connection between these 2 points. Could the blood pool that Wuqiu had created have something to do with Liang Danhuo? The matters in front of them now suddenly seemed to form a huge, invisible web. The individual threads crisscrossed in a complicated tangle, but they were all related. The pentacolor sacred light, Li Jinglong replied. Then I used the heart lamp to break through the spell. When she was releasing the blood mist, she hid herself in it, Lu Su said. If we can catch a glimpse of her original form, then, with the help of an artifact, we may be able to deal her a lethal blow. I hope that Zhao Zilong can bring back some useful information, Li Jinglong said, resigned. Let's go with this plan then. From the start, Li Jinglong had wanted to wait for night to fall, so that he could have Lu Su bring him to Sibei. Gao Xianzi, however, sent out an urgent call for the troops to set out, and if they did not follow, they would be left behind very quickly. Plus, Li Jinglong had yet to fully recover, and his riding speed would already slow them down. The heart lamp can get rid of it, Lu Su said. In the dark night, after a brief rest, the vast army began to move once more. Correct. Li Jinglong was already very tired. The several days that they had spent marching forward caused his entire body to be in great pain, and a lack of sleep made him irritated and short-tempered. Lu Su spurred his horse forward, catching up with Atai, and they protected him from the left and right. Lu Su suddenly said, "The heart lamp is still in you, Jinglong." Li Jinglong smiled bitterly. "Lu Su, stop comforting me." Lu Su replied just as abruptly, "Why do you not believe it?" "Because of how your heart was swayed." Of the members of the exorcism department, only Lu Su knew everything that Li Jinglong had hidden away in his heart. Atai heard, but he did not leave, he simply followed silently alongside them. "It's not that I don't believe it," Li Jinglong suddenly said. "Even if I believe it now, what use will it be when we fight? You're telling me that the heart lamp is still in my body, yet I cannot even draw a bow. If I charge towards An Lushan with this broken sword in some mad attempt to seek my own death, would the heart lamp come out and protect me then?" Lu Su stopped talking. "I also hope for a miracle," Li Jinglong said. "But in reality, every time that I have placed my hopes in a miracle happening, fate has never favored me. Later, I thought, never mind putting my faith in miracles. It'll still be alright if I depend on myself though, right?" And saying that, he smiled bitterly, before continuing, "But even if I prepared for everything that I should have, I always end up being dealt a fatal blow at the most crucial moment." In the dark night, there was only the sound of the horses' hooves. Ashinakayang suddenly said, "I'll go scout out the path ahead." Ashinakayang went off into the distance. In the darkness, Atai said, unhurriedly, "Speaking of the blood Yao, and speaking of the blood pool, I suddenly remembered something." Li Jinglong was silent, and he did not respond. Atai continued, "The first time that the heart lamp was released, no one who was present is here now, but I remember that afterwards, you all said that you were able to escape back then because of the power that had exploded out of you in that single moment." Lu Su had heard Hung Jun allude to this before, but not in any great detail. Upon hearing those words, he held his breath and listened intently. "That's right," Li Jinglong said heavily. "Now that I think back, that felt like another world." He spurred his horse forward, moving neither too fast nor too slow. Looking into the distance, what he seemed to see was a road that had no future, a path that led to an endless abyss of despair. He thought about the reason that the heart lamp had suddenly explosively worked that day, and he tacitly understood why. Back then, the Yaogwai had grabbed Hung Jun by the nape of his neck and pressed a blade to his ear. Li Jinglong himself had been sinking into the pool of blood, powerless to do anything, forced to watch as that Yaogwai cut open Hung Jun's ear. Hung Jun had been in great pain, his eyes filled with tears as if he was begging for mercy, or as if he was calling upon his protector God. When he thought about the emotions he had experienced back then, Li Jinglong had only felt a surge of power explode outwards from deep in his heart. "I only had one thought," Li Jinglong said, "to protect him. Even if I broke every bone in my body doing so, I would not have regretted it." Lu Su said hesitantly, "Then, after he comes back, should we let his ear get cut again? Can those two even be considered on the same magnitude?" Li Jinglong couldn't bear to hear any more. Atai piped up. "One night, Tu Raindik told me that she thinks the reason why the heart lamp has not appeared again is because..." Li Jinglong couldn't help thinking back over that moment in the blood pool, when Hung Jun had been suffering in front of him, how he had activated the heart lamp in the end. But just before he was able to gain that power, in a snatch of time so brief that it passed in the blink of an eye, he seemed to have silently accepted a truth, that he had always been the god that protected Hung Jun. It was as if fate had decided that he was some sort of a divine general, whose sole purpose in coming to the mortal realm was to protect Hung Jun. But they had never seen each other before, and all of their memories had been sealed away. When a specific scene played out in front of them, this seal had been broken for Hung Jun's sake, and the heart lamp had also become a part of his own soul. I understand, Li Jinglong said in reply. The heart lamp had appeared in that moment, because it had been born for Hung Jun's sake. The heart lamp had been extinguished in that moment, because it had been extinguished for Hung Jun. Li Jinglong had finally fully understood that moment. Whether or not the heart lamp recognized him was no longer important. In reality, the heart lamp had never recognized him. This light that scattered the darkness had been born solely because of Hung Jun. He needed him, so in that moment, that bright light had surged up out of him. The reason that I lost the heart lamp, Li Jinglong said, was because I felt that perhaps Hung Jun no longer needed me. From the very start, this was what had brought him the most pain. This was his heart devil. How could that be? A Tai asked. How could that be? Lu Su echoed. Li Jinglong pulled his horse to a stop, silently studying the area ahead. A Tai suggested, you should go find your feelings from back in the very beginning, Ba. That's very hard, Li Jinglong said. You don't know how I. Because the future that we are working so hard for is the one where he becomes Mara and completely destroys this world. Lu Su asked. It's exactly because of that that we need to avoid letting all of that happen, isn't that right? The big wolf said so as well, that he cannot suffer for the sake of all of the beings in this world. No one was born solely for the sake of doing so. Li Jinglong breathed in deeply. A Tai added, all you need to think about is, if you cannot summon the heart lamp anymore, then Hung Jun will have to sacrifice his own life and die for our sakes. That will be enough. Though Hung Jun was not by his side, Li Jinglong recalled countless moments between them. Those familiar emotions swelled in his chest. He may hate me, Li Jinglong said, but I hope that he will live on well. Lu Su and A Tai exchanged a glance, but they did not reply. Li Jinglong spurred his horse back into motion. After a long period of silence, rapid hoofbeats broke through the quiet of the long night. Ashinakayan hurried towards them with a torch in his hand. They've spotted the enemy camp ahead. In the dark night, the marching army had discovered a disturbance that had not been easy to spot. The river separated them from their enemy, but the place that An Lushan had chosen to set up camp was almost 10 li closer than what their scouts had originally reported. The erroneous information had caused the marching army to lose the upper hand they had. Thankfully, the rebels had yet to discover them, and up ahead, Gao Xianzi had already given the order that the entire army was to form up into an attack formation. The vanguard would rest for now, but when the signal, an Alhut arrow, was fired, they would gather their forces and attack, setting fire to the enemy camp as they ambushed them. In the night so dark that an outstretched hand disappeared into it, the Carpiao, dripping wet, climbed onto the bank. It was so cold that it couldn't stop shivering. It tugged off a piece of square cloth and wrapped it around its head, before glancing around it. Just as it took a few steps forward, it startled, it had spotted the Yaogwai camp. They had actually chosen to set up camp so close. The Carpiao seemed to realize something, and it crept through the gaps between several tents. What it saw was that at the center of the masses of tents, there was a huge one, and it seemed to be heavily guarded, with soldiers patrolling all around it. The tent was blazing with light. What is this? I didn't see such a thing last time, the Carpiao murmured to itself. The Carpiao tried to get close to the tent. It coiled up its arms and legs, and it lay down on the ground, twitching slightly. A spring rain had just fallen, and the ground was very wet. The fish's body was covered with mud, and it looked no different from the ground itself. The night was also dark, so the patrolling guards did not even spare a single glance for what went by their feet. Just like that, the Carpiao slowly approached that tent, step by step. It got to the edge of the tent and took advantage of the gap between the tent cloth and the ground to squeeze in. Some of its scales got caught on the edge of the tent, and 2 or 3 were ripped off, which caused it so much pain that it almost yelped. Liang Danhuo was holding an ancient wooden dagger as she stood in front of a huge bird. That huge bird was plastered in human skin, and under its half-translucent skin was flesh shot through with green veins. The dagger in Liang Danhuo's hand was covered in sigils, and they glowed with a green light. She was chanting an incantation, and that huge bird suddenly lit up and moved. The Carpiao was so frightened by that it screamed internally. After Liang Danhuo cast her spell, she seemed to be very exhausted, and her crimson flesh and blood exposed to the outside seemed to wither. Evidently, she had expended too much of her magic. Yao Guai hurriedly came in behind her, falling over themselves to help her. She staggered out of the tent, but before leaving, said, "Guard this place well. Don't let any person in." People couldn't enter, but she never mentioned Yao couldn't come in, the Carpiao thought. After Liang Danhuo left, no Yao were left in the tent, so the Carpiao carefully walked towards that huge bird and walked in a circle around it. The Yao bird had been plastered with the skins of humans, and its wings were half spread. Its bird head looked forbidding and grotesque, its bird bones plastered with human skin. It looked like a huge kite made out of skin. The skins were even covered in tattooed sigils. The Carpiao recognized several as skins that Liang Danhuo had changed into before. From the looks of it, the rebels had seemingly prepared some sort of powerful yaoguai. If it could rip the skins on the wings, then perhaps it might not be able to fly anymore. In the dark night, the Tang troops whispered and rustled as they hid themselves in the forest, facing the creek. On the other side of the creek were the plains of the Shan Commandery, which stretched as far as the eye could see, and on the plains was camped the 50,000-strong army of Enlushan. Gao Xianzi had given the order for them to hide and prepare for an ambush. This time, almost 10,000 soldiers had come, and if they were to march out en masse, as well as set fire to the camp, they might be able to catch the enemy off guard. But across the creek, the camp was completely dark. There weren't even campfires. The large encampment looked like a monster that had swallowed the army whole, and in the darkness came the sound of the wind gusting through. "They probably won't fail, right?" Lu Su said quietly. "If they can fail even at this, then the Tang troops had better not fight at all." Ever since they had retreated west from Luoyang several months ago, the Tang troops had seemed to lose every battle they fought. If they didn't surrender, then they were utterly routed. Lu Su had fought in Geshu Han's army before, and he had never seen such a useless army. "We have no choice," Li Jinglong replied, frowning in frustration. "These are all militia that were drafted from the towns and cities, and they don't even have full sets of armor. They can't be compared with you border troops." "Shh," Ashinakayang said, emerging from the water of the river. "There's no ambush on the eastern road. You go instead," Li Jinglong said to Lu Su. As light as a swallow, Lu Su spread his arms and leaped towards the river. When he fell towards the water, Ashinakayang tossed a tree branch, which just so happened to land where Lu Su was stepping. He then touched down lightly on that tree branch, before flying over the river. Crossing the river on a single reed, Li Jinglong said quietly, almost unable to believe what he had seen. "That is truly a divine skill." Lu Su circled around the plains on the other side of the river, not daring to get too close to the enemy camp. Very soon, he returned, and he said to Ashinakayang, "Are you blind or stupid? Did you not see those 8 huge yaoguai lined up across the plains?" "What yaoguai?" Ashinakayang was utterly confused. In the darkness, the 8 earth-swallowing beasts that had swallowed the corpses in Luoyang stood guard outside the encampment in a line. "How are we supposed to fight them?" Atai asked. "Are all of you brainless? Li Jinglong could bear it no longer. This is us respecting you. Zenshi. Lu Su said. Li Jinglong had actually forgotten for a time that An Lushan had these Yaoguai under his command, so in the beginning, he actually hadn't thought of a way to deal with them. After he thought for a bit, he said, "Atai, throw your fireballs into their mouths to explode them. Lu Su, lead them over here one by one so we can deal with them. Qian, go inform General Fen not to attack just yet. Let us deal with the enemies first, then we can discuss." Ashina Qian went to pass on the message. Li Jinglong studied the opposite shore for a while, before suddenly saying, "If worse comes to worst, we can just summon a dragon. Where are our trump cards, the dragon scales?" "Atai, mine is in Turandik's hands." "Lu Su, I gave mine to the big wolf, but they went north." Li Jinglong. "No one had a dragon scale on them." Atai suddenly remembered, "Zhao Zilong has one. Who told it to go to the enemy camp?" Li Jinglong asked. "Lu Su, wasn't it you?" Everyone looked at each other. The only dragon scale they had was with the Carpiao, but Li Jinglong had sent the Carpiao off. Atai said, "Qian should have another one. Don't worry. I just hope that he hasn't given it to Hung Jun." Li Jinglong. End chapter. Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 168. Utterly rooted. Lu Su had taken a crossbow with him, and he had crossed the river to lure the Yaoguai out. Atai and Li Jinglong stood by the river's edge. Not long after, the sound of thundering movements came from afar, and one of the earth-swallowing beasts came racing after Lu Su as they dashed towards the river. Just as that earth-swallowing beast was about to open its mouth and let out a roar, Li Jinglong shouted, "Now!" Instantly, Atai conjured a fireball that lit up the waterway. When they saw the fireball, the soldiers hiding on either bank fired their arrows, which flew into that earth-swallowing beast's mouth. Its roar was cut off before it could begin, and it suddenly shut its mouth, a red glow shooting forth from its belly. There was a dull boom of an explosion, and it fell into the river. The river exploded with a wave of mud and rocks, which blocked up a good half of the waterway, instantly changing the flow of the river, sending it seeping into the forest. Li Jinglong had never imagined that the earth-swallowing beast would actually cough up stomach. This was the vanguard's first encounter with a Yaoguai, and when the river swept over them, they instantly grew nervous. "Steady!" Li Jinglong bellowed behind him. "Stay steady, Lu Su. The next one." But right then, from the forest behind them came the sound of the hooting arrow. Who gave the order? Li Jinglong was incensed. "Kill! Don't charge!" The crowd of people was instantly left floundering for purchase. Ashina Qian galloped over on horseback, roaring, "Bian Lingcheng is urging the troops to march forth. Is he insane?" Li Jinglong shouted. "He thinks that we're trying to drag things out." Ashina Qian shouted. "He wants to force us to fight." The very first person that Li Jinglong wanted to kill was not an enemy, rather, he wanted to turn around and butcher Bian Lingcheng, who was on their side. They had only taken care of one of the 8 earth-swallowing beasts, and the vanguard of Tang troops mistakenly thought that they had killed all the Yaoguai. Plus, since the mud and rocks had dammed up the river, they all began to charge forward. "What should we do?" Lu Su shouted. "Should we lure another one over?" "No, don't," Li Jinglong yelled. "We'll act when we see an opportunity to do so. Split up and deal with them." The person with the strongest fighting power in the exorcism department was Atai, but Atai often needed protection during the time he was casting a spell. Lu Su's speed was the highest among them, but he had almost no artifacts that he could use to deal with a Yaoguai. Hung Jun, who was the most capable at fighting, was not here either, otherwise he would have lifted the immortal slaying glaive and cut down each and every one that came at them, and none of these minor Yaoguai would have been his opponent. "Let's fight!" Ashina Qian shouted. This was the first time that the exorcism department was fighting side by side with the military soldiers, and it was absolute chaos. Li Jinglong finally made up his mind and shouted, "Charge!" Everyone spurred their horses into motion and charged out of the forest, rushing towards the opposite shore of the lake. Lu Su shouted at Li Jinglong, "You can't ride out into battle. Zenchi." But Li Jinglong did not heed his words. Like he had before, he rode forward at the head of his men, the sword of wisdom in hand as he led the exorcists in a charge towards the enemy encampment. All three of the remaining exorcists went bug-eyed at that. They hurriedly spurred their horses into motion and raced after Li Jinglong. In the rebel camp, En Lushan held down Liang Danhuo's head with one hand as billows of black qi soaked into her body. The painted skin Yao's original bright red flesh and blood was slowly turning pitch black, and the devil qi slowly seeped out of her very flesh and blood vessels. At this moment, En Lushan's body was so swollen that he looked like a leather pouch, and his movements were slow and lethargic. It seemed as if this body of his could no longer accommodate any more devil qi, and was on the brink of reaching its limit. Suddenly, war cries sounded outside the camp. "It is almost time," En Lushan's horrific voice said. "I can feel it. There is too much life, and this wave of despair will assist me in taking that very last step." Liang Danhuo's voice grew increasingly hoarse and twisted. "I will slaughter them all for you." But En Lushan ordered, "Help me out. Provisions, there are too many provisions." In the tent, the Carpio was trying to figure out a way to rip off the human skin that had been lashed tightly to the bird skeleton, but those human skins were sewn on too well. It also hadn't been able to figure out what this bird was used for, so it grabbed onto the bird's butt and climbed up. Just as it was looking around, Liang Danhuo suddenly led a large group of Yaoguai in, saying, "No need to be afraid. With the earth-swallowing beasts standing guard, they won't be able to fight their way in for a while yet." What the Carpio was most afraid of was seeing Liang Danhuo, and its soul immediately flew out of its body. It plunged right into the bird's butt and scrambled inside. Liang Danhuo climbed up to the nape of that huge bird's neck, addressing the Yaoguai below. "Go and take up guard positions out in front of the camp. Kill whoever you can." The Yaoguai all agreed in unison, before they scattered. The Carpio was absolutely terrified, and it began to crawl towards the bird's stomach. This bird was not completely made of human skin, there were odd chunks of black-colored flesh that made up the inside. Each chunk was pressed up against the next one, and they were packed in very tightly. The Carpio squeezed through the gaps, until it made its way to the neck. A dagger suddenly stabbed in from the bird's back, almost skewering it through. Liang Danhuo was right above his head, and she uttered a spell. The green glow of the dagger instantly spread through that big bird's body, swiftly dispersing through the black chunks of flesh that made up the bird's viscera. The entire bird actually began to flap its wings, and it rose into the air. The Carpio was squished in between chunks of meat, and it was only a half kun away from that dagger. Its eyes were wide open, and its fishy mouth gaped, it didn't dare to even twitch. The monstrous bird rose into the air, and the Carpio tilted its head, looking through the bird's beak towards the outside, only to see the tent falling away and the huge bird rising into the sky. It stuck half of its fishy head out, and when it looked down, it saw that there was a wooden pendant hanging around the bird's neck, on which was written a word that drew the eye with the bright crimson blood. It was written in Jingwei. The Carpio. At the same time, on the battleground on the plains, many of the soldiers sleeping soundly in their tents had been startled awake. The ambushers, some tens of thousands of men, let out earth-shaking war cries as they thundered towards the camp in the dark of the night. But before the two sides clashed properly, there was an ang sound from in front of the camp, and the earth-swallowing beasts lifted their heads and let out their own cries. In that moment, the ground, with the rebels' camp as the epicenter, began to tilt alarmingly. The ground that the soldiers were riding up immediately turned into a steep slope, which was tilting further and further up with each passing moment. The Tang troops let out surprised, Shocked yells, even as Li Jinglong shouted, "Hold!" Ashinakayan cursed, before shouting, "We haven't finished preparing yet." Which bastard gave the order to charge? The earth was truly tipping over from under them. The exorcists scrambled up that slope, even as the world around them, and even the heavens above, seemed to upend oddly around them. Lu Su shouted, "We have to kill all of the Yao beasts." Atai shouted back, "Get ready. We're going to fly." Atai then fell slightly back and raised his godly hurricane fan. A whirlwind swept in, and with a hong, engulfed the three of them and their horses and pulled them away from the slope. The horses screamed, and Ashinakayan and Lu Su, who found themselves rushed in front of the earth-swallowing beasts, let out loud yelps in unison. The two of them stabbed with their swords at the same time, thrusting them firmly into an earth-swallowing beast's throat. The second earth-swallowing beast immediately let out a wild bellow, and the tilt of the ground slowly lessened. Upon seeing that, Li Jinglong shouted, "Exorcists, hear me. Vanquish the Yao first." The 8 earth-swallowing beasts called upon their Yao power at the same time, and the world once again began to tilt. Every time they killed one, the ground would slope a little less. Lu Su and Ashinakayan combined forces to get rid of another one, before they each turned and went off separately to kill the others. Atai then called up the whirlwind and swept the two of them towards the top of the incline. At the same time, the rebel troops had already started to appear in great numbers at the top of the slope in the back, and they all lifted their spears. Li Jinglong turned back and shouted, "Retreat! They're going to charge." It was at that moment that Gao Xianzi finally made it onto the battlefield. Just as he was about to issue his orders, he saw the terrain suddenly change, and his expression was one of stunned shock. What had originally been flat plains had turned into a huge slope. How had this happened? Lu Su and Ashinakayan split up, dashing up the slope towards the earth-swallowing beasts. For the sake of protecting the 6 that were left, the Yaogwai all dashed over as well, but Lu Su leaped into the air and somersaulted, pushing the head of one of the beasts down. The sharp dagger in his hand glinted with light, and the earth-swallowing beast's entire chin came off. Fresh blood spurted everywhere, and the beast turned and charged forward, slamming into another one of the beasts, causing the world to turn upside down for a bit. Ashinakayan, meanwhile, leapt into the air and spread his cape, blocking the arrows that came flying at them from the rear lines. He then sent 2 throwing knives shooting forth like a hawk, going right for the eyes of one of the beasts. The defensive line that the earth-swallowing beasts formed was immediately thrown into chaos, and the enemy's lines of defense collapsed in quick succession. The slope rose again, but just as Lu Su was about to kill another one, he suddenly heard a bell ring thunderously from behind the enemy lines. Dong! The other 4 beasts suddenly began to bellow, and the slope rose swiftly. Li Jinglong sensed that something wasn't right, and hurriedly shouted, "Retreat! All divisions, retreat!" The slope that was originally tilting towards the Tang troops rose swiftly into the air, lifting Li Jinglong and the rest of them up above the enemy combatants' lines. But amidst the chaos, no one had heard his shouting, and just as the Tang troops began to climb their way up with great effort, that earth-swallowing beast changed the slope of the ground, tilting it downwards. Thousands of men and horses then began to roll down. Immediately, the men and horses went down, and their charge turned into a torrential rush. Lu Su and Ashinakayan were not prepared for the slope to suddenly change, and instantly began to tumble into the darkness. Just as Lu Su was about to turn around and start climbing up, his foot suddenly stepped over thin air, and he immediately shouted, "A ditch!" Behind the earth-swallowing beasts was a huge ditch almost a jang in width and several jang in depth. The enemies were all waiting on the other side, and they drew their bows and nocked their arrows. Ashinakayan immediately felt a cold chill run down his spine. In this moment, he finally figured out what the enemy troops had planned. But they understood the situation too late. Above their heads were tens of thousands of Tang soldiers and horses, who lost their balance and rolled into each other, rushing towards the ditch. Ashinakayang shouted, "Jump over it!" The other side was filled with rebel soldiers who were waiting for them to charge their way. Lu Su gritted his teeth, grabbed Ashinakayang's collar with one hand, and stabbed the sword into the ground with the other. They used their forward momentum to spin around, and Ashinakayang was sent flying. "Lu Su!" Ashinakayang shouted from where he flew through the air. Lu Su shouted back, "What? You're more handsome than Hung Jun." Ashinakayang yelled. "Today, I've started to fall in love with you." Lu Su. Li Jinglong was just about to kick his horse into motion and move back, but in the span of a brief moment, the thousands of Tang troops came tumbling down from up above him on the slope. Li Jinglong had no choice but to leap onto the horse's back. In that moment, an immeasurably majestic scene unfolded. Thousands of rebel arrows flew through the air, while the Tang troops, soldiers, and horses both, tumbled in to fill the ditch, letting out pained cries as they did. One of the war horses charging down the slope crashed into Li Jinglong, and the chi in his body was immediately thrown into disorder. 2 stray arrows hit him, and a terrible pain stabbed into his heart. In the very last moment before he fell into the ditch, something suddenly crashed into his side. A brilliant glow appeared in the darkness, and with a deer's call, the white deer appeared, its body made up of glowing points of light. It dodged the arrows coming head-on at it, bearing Li Jinglong away into the sky. The white deer flew over the battlefield, heading out of arrow range. The rebels kept firing into the ditch, and countless sharp blades had also been set up at the bottom, so the Tang troops that fell into the ditch immediately perished. "Li Jinglong, leap over there." "I can't leap over there," Lu Su's cold voice said darkly. "We can't win." "Accept it." Li Jinglong. Li Jinglong looked down at the ground, only to see that a veritable mountain of Tang soldiers was filling that ditch. Li Jinglong shouted, "Kill those earth-swallowing beasts." The white deer turned in the air and descended downwards, but the earth-swallowing beasts had already long since retreated. The ditch, after swallowing tens of thousands of Tang troops, finally leveled out again, and only then did the main force of the Tang army charge onto the battlefield proper. Feng Changqing and Gao Xianzi were directing the main force, and they were shouting, "Steady! March forward!" The soldiers, however, were feeling insurmountable fear, and they were all looking up to the sky. There was a hoarse cry, and in the night sky, a huge bird spread its wings and flew towards them. At the same time, the rebels lifted their spears, and with a wave of battle cries, trampled over the ditch filled with bodies, starting the first charge towards the Tang troops. The huge bird's wingspan was so wide it seemed to be able to cover the entire sky, and as it let out its hoarse screech, waves of bloody mist seeped out of it. The blood rushed towards the rear of the enemy lines, swooping low over the battlefield. Gao Xianzi's face paled, but he ordered, "Everyone fire." As the Tang troops charged, arrows shot into the sky. But the blood mist suffused the air, and it was also the dark of night, adding to that the sturdiness of those human skins. There was no way the arrows could pierce the bird. When Li Jinglong turned his head back, he heard a pained wail. The blood mist parted. The main commander, Gao Xianzi, had been snatched up and was rising into the sky, before he plummeted down to the earth. "General Gao!" Li Jinglong let out an explosive shout. The Tang troops' formation was instantly thrown into disarray, at the exact moment when the two fronts collided with each other, enemy and friend swirling about each other. Without waiting for Li Jinglong to give an order, the white deer bounded swiftly into the air, speeding towards that odd bird. As of right now, the only one who knew how to fly was Lu Su. Li Jinglong gritted his teeth and pulled out the arrows in his body. Fresh blood spurted forth, splattering the white deer's body. The white deer shouted, "What should we do?" "You're hurt." "I see her," Li Jinglong said. "Smash into her and send her down to the ground." "She knows how to fly," the white deer shouted. "Where's Atai?" "Atai?" Li Jinglong passed over the heads of the main forces, flying towards where the fires were shooting in every direction. Tai had called up a whirlwind and was rising into the air, about to deal with that strange bird. Li Jinglong flew his way and shouted, "I'll help. I'll protect you guys." Tai shouted back. Several beams of fire then shot forth, flying towards the human-skinned Jingwei. The Jingwei tilted and dodged the beams, but in the blink of an eye, the white deer and Li Jinglong crashed into the Jingwei's back. As soon as the white deer leaped onto the Jingwei, it turned back into Lu Su, who struck forth with a fist as fast as a flash of lightning. Liang Danhuo's blood hand clawed back at him, and Lu Su faced off against her fingers with his fists. In the span of a short few seconds, they had already exchanged several blows. Li Jinglong let out a cry as he stabbed his sword towards the center of Liang Danhuo's back. She, however, kicked back with one leg and almost swept him off the Jingwei. When the Carpiao heard Lu Su and Li Jinglong's voices, it immediately grew nervous. Liang Danhuo shouted right over its head, "I was just wondering where to go to find you. Turns out that you've delivered yourselves to my doorstep." Li Jinglong grabbed the side of one of the Jingwei's wings. Lu Su and Liang Danhuo were as swift as a whirlwind, and Liang Danhuo, her entire body covered in blood, shouted, "Go die. The one who should die is you, bitch," Lu Su said coldly. The fists that filled the air turned into palm strikes, which passed through Liang Danhuo's bloody claws, and Lu Su landed a solid slap on the painted skin Yao's cheek. Her neck twisted to the side, and fresh blood spurted in every direction. Liang Danhuo's rage peaked, and she immediately went berserk. A bloody mist burst out of her body, coiling towards Lu Su, but Lu Su sped through the fog like a flash of lightning, appearing on the bird's tail. The blood mist billowed and came at him once more, but Lu Su moved even faster now, and with a flash, dashed to the Jingwei's head. It was right then that fireballs came shooting at them from far in the distance, striking the Jingwei. That huge bird quivered violently. This was the first time that Liang Danhuo had run into such a difficult opponent. She hoped that this speed had already used up much of Lu Su's energy, and she yelled wildly, "Let's see how long you can last." She then turned back into a human, reaching out to grab the dagger stabbed into the Jingwei's head. But just as she was about to grab the dagger, her palm closed around empty air. The dagger was pulled into the bird's head. Liang Danhuo. Liang Danhuo's fingers grabbed the very end of the dagger's hilt, trying to pull it out, but there seemed to be something inside sucking that dagger in. The Carpiao had its hands wrapped around the dagger, and the two of them struggled against each other. The Jingwei immediately began to screech, and the bird's body trembled. Upon seeing a chance, Li Jinglong used one of the shivering motions to propel himself up onto the bird's back, before he then lifted a foot in an unexpected ambush, shouting, "Get down there!" The Jingwei immediately tilted to the side. Liang Danhuo shrieked shrilly as she was tossed off the bird's back. The Carpiao climbed out of the Jingwei's head, grabbed that dagger, and hurriedly stabbed it back into the Jingwei's head, shouting, "Li Jinglong!" Li Jinglong and Lu Su hurriedly glanced, only to see the Carpiao. Before they could say anything, they were also tossed off the bird's back. Right after that, the white deer appeared again, with Li Jinglong on its back, shouting, "We'll leave this to you." It then bounded across the sky, in the direction where the painted skin Yao had fallen. What? The Carpiao was riding on the bird's neck, the dagger clutched in its hands as it looked around hurriedly at its surroundings. The ground below was already in utter chaos, and in the darkness, the rebels were chasing the Tang troops around, killing them where they stood. It couldn't tell where any of its comrades in arms had gone. "Where are my people?" The Carpiao pressed down slightly on that dagger, and the Jingwei flapped its wings, swooping down towards the ground. It tried to lift the dagger up, and the Jingwei rose. When it pressed down, the Jingwei went low. Tilting it to the left turned the Jingwei left, and tilting it to the right turned the Jingwei right. When it pushed the dagger forward, The Jingui let out a shrill, piercing cry that caused pain to those who heard it. It opened its mouth, a green glow gathering inside it, which came spewing out. The green glow shot towards the ground, forming a pillar of light. Wherever the pillar went, the huge rocks, the dirt, and even the vegetation rose into the air. There was a strong earthquake which shook the ground below, and rocks flew into the air, forming a ravine. The soil on either side of the ravine spilled inwards, constantly filling in the center, swallowing up a bunch of the soldiers who were fighting wildly. Wow, the Carpio was greatly startled. It murmured to itself, then what happens if I pull it back? When it pulled it back, nothing happened. All right then. The Carpio directed the Jingui towards the rebel camp, only to see several thousands of Yao and rebel soldiers all crowded together in the enemy camp, slaughtering their way through the Tang troops. The Carpio had no time to spare to figure out who was friendly and who wasn't, and it immediately pushed the dagger, spraying green light everywhere, causing a mudslide. The front line had been pushed to the very edge of the river. The ground had been covered in muddy water to begin with, and when the Jingui's magic sprayed over it, the dirty water, sand, and rocks rose into the air, turning the ground below into a morass of muddy swamp, which sank all of the rebels standing on it. End chapter.